Welcome to the archive. In today's book review episode, we're going to be talking about DMT, the Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman. If you've read the book, please let us know in the comments, and also let us know how you feel about this book review in general. And please leave us a like, a share, and definitely subscribe. And with that, let's get right into it.
So this book is a nonfiction science text that I'm extremely excited to talk about today.
Yes, me too.
Been waiting a long time to kind of break into the realm of psychedelics and altered states of consciousness through this channel, something I'm really passionate about. I've done a lot of study over the years, and I'm just really excited. So thank you for doing it with me.
Yeah, I mean, this book was heavily influential on me, so I appreciate us being able to do this. I often find a lot of people don't know about the book. They know more about the documentary with Joe Rogan, Dennis McKenna, Alex Gray, and a multitude of other psychonauts. But it did actually come from a book originally.
Right.
And we want to talk about Rick Strassman a little bit. Do you want to give a little bit of background on Rick?
So he is a medical doctor. He's like a straight edge scientist. Yes. He's no nonsense type of guy. Through the years doing his research, I think his opinions on things have changed. His outlook on life and his worldview has shifted a lot. But definitely in the beginning of his research, it was very straight edge, scientifically oriented, experimentative, not a lot of woo-woo. He didn't have a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
And when you read this text, you will get a little bit of that sprinkled in, just because there are a lot of interviews that are happening with actual human beings who have used the substance under his supervision. But from himself as the author, you don't get a lot of that shoved down your throat, which is super nice.
And I'm pretty confident that he actually started researching melatonin. And I think his interest sparked because he saw that melatonin, as well as a multitude of other endogenous neurochemicals, were so similar molecularly to DMT, yet they produce these radically different experiences. You know, melatonin makes you a little bit tired, and DMT takes you into another world. And I think he thought that was interesting and wanted to look further. So it wasn't like he got into science to promote or substantiate the benefits of psychedelics. Like, he really stumbled upon this.
Kind of took him down the lane a little bit, like the Yellow Brick Road.
Yes, exactly.
A little bit.
Right.
Oh dear. So, a little bit about the book itself. Now that we've edified this man, Rick Strassman, as a hardcore scientist, for any of those doubters out there, or people who just don't have a lot of respect for woo-woo or taste for it.
Yes. The
book subtitle is A Doctor's Revolutionary Research into the Biology of Near-Death and Mystical Experiences. So what this book actually is an account of Rick Strassman's early days in the human research experimentation with this psychedelic drug, and all of the user experiences, sort of anecdotes and actual trip reports written down as he sort of analyzes all of the data and puts it in this book for you, the reader, in a very cogent way. He structures the book like as follows. First, he gives a small anecdote about DMT, giving DMT to a patient, sort of sets the tone of the book. Then he gets into a history of psychedelics, an explanation of the classic psychedelics, LSD, mescaline, which is peyote, ibogaine. There's psilocybin, which are magic mushrooms, and a couple of other drugs that he talks about. And he shows in the text their molecular structure and how incredibly similar all of those are to serotonin, as well as tryptamine.
And melatonin as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I believe melatonin might be in the text. It's been a while since I've looked through it. But they're all very similar, at least so similar to serotonin. And serotonin in the serotonergic process is the main chemical neurotransmitter that operates on a day-to-day basis within our biological system and our neurochemistry to keep us alive.
Right. Well, it's as far as the model we have currently, most psychologists and neuroscientists agree that serotonin is pretty much the key to creating your conscious experience. It literally is what generates everything you see, feel, touch, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it has a huge role to play in our bodies, from homeostasis to exactly that, world building, to our vision, our sensory perceptions, everything. It's so important.
It's almost like a filter.
Yeah, it is the thing in which we require the most to live as functioning conscious entities.
Right.
And so he gives, again, a brief history rundown of the similarities between these things and why it's so peculiar that DMT specifically, more so than any of those other classical psychedelics, is the most similar to serotonin, and why it's so peculiar to him, and sort of his motivation for why he got into this.
Yeah, and just a side caveat is the discovery of those similarities is what sparked the fire under some scientists to go and prove that we actually produce DMT endogenously, as well as, pretty much most plants and mammals.
Right, and so that's a whole other realm
just
of discussion.
A small caveat.
But it's important. It's
Yeah.
important. He doesn't get too much about that in this text because there is a lot of conflicting research out
Yes.
there. There's not really a great consensus, but he does talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and
He
this was
definitely does.
early on before a lot of scientists had gone on to try to prove that claim,
Right.
So
And so if you do pick up this book and read it, and I highly recommend that you do, it is a little outdated on certain things. He makes a few
Yes.
assumptions that may or may not stand the test of time, right? After he talks about the classic psychedelics, he gets right into DMT, explaining what dimethyltryptamine, DMT, is, how it operates on our bodies, why it's so peculiar, the types of experiences that a person might have when using the substance. To break it down in brief, DMT, as Terence McKenna, one of the most popular psychonauts. Psychonaut means someone who avidly uses psychedelics.
A proponent of psychedelics, if you will.
He's one of the most famous psychonauts ever. He popularized psychedelics in the West. He gave a lot of public speeches from the 80s to the late 90s.
Yeah.
Wrote
many books.
Wrote a few really
Yeah.
influential books, for sure. And Terence McKenna says that DMT is the most powerful psychedelic substance known to man. And while that might be debatable subjectively, DMT definitely is peculiar because it is one of the most fast-acting psychedelics
Yes.
known to man. It is called the businessman's drug because literally anywhere from 2 to 10 or 15 minutes, depending on your biochemistry, the experience will peak around 2 to 5 minutes and totally bring you back to baseline up to 10 to 15.
Yeah, because your body knows exactly what to do with it because it's a serotonin derivative and it's broken down in your intestines within a matter of minutes. So the experience is very fast acting.
Yeah, and so the book goes a little bit into that process of how the body absorbs the DMT when you use the drug, how all of your systems sort of flip the switch, so to speak, and just tackle it, like get this out of the guy's system. We need to get this out of their system right now. And he gives a lot of information about DMT, how to use it, how he administered it in his scientific studies, and everything under the sun in brief in just one chapter.
Yeah, and including a lot of, we're just talking about the first chapter.
Just the chapter on DMT for the most part.
Yep.
Yeah, just keeping it in structure of the text. It's been a long time since I actually read the book, honestly. I read the book when I was 12 the first time, and then the last time I read it, I think I was 16 or 17, but I flipped through it to do this episode. And ultimately, this entire section of the book is dedicated specifically to DMT, which would make sense because it's in the name of the text of the actual book.
Right. In the next chapter, they talk a little bit about the pineal gland, and there's a lot of woo surrounding that conversation. And there's probably, like we said, we haven't read it in a while, but there's probably some outdated information. But the Egyptians thought the pineal gland was the seat of the soul. It was basically the center of all your conscious experience was generated out of the pineal gland and your connection to the divine and all those things. And the speculation is that the pineal gland is where the DMT secretes in your brain, allowing you to have, an endogenous experience without the drug. So I think that's why he thought it was important enough to include it.
Right. So to piggyback a little bit on what you said, there is a lot of speculation out there, a lot of misinformation and woo-woo regarding the pineal gland.
Yes.
Some people pronounce it pineal. It's like tomato.
Yeah.
But the assumption that Rick Strassman first posited or put forth is that the pineal gland is the literal seat of the soul.
Right.
So if all things are interconnected in life, if there's a biological side, this sort of like machinery that allows us to live in the physical reality, there's some mental aspect of reality and some spiritual aspect of reality. They all have to be sort of like connected somehow. Even if you think about these realities as like hyper removed from each other, physical space, mental space, spiritual space, although they're sort of all interconnected, how they are tangential to each other, where they touch, these touching points, DMT as a literal physical chemical is that thing that is tangential to the spiritual realm that links it to the physical body and animates us.
Hence the name, the spirit molecule, which really perfectly puts together the idea of biology and spirituality.
Right. And some really odd peculiarities with DMT that Rick Strassman discovered is that around 49 days after conception, a growing fetus begins to develop the pineal gland before even their brain begins to develop.
Well, and that's interesting too, because the pineal gland also has a geometrical allure, because it's every part of the brain reflects itself from the left and the right hemisphere.
Bicamerally, right?
Yeah, exactly. But the pineal gland is dead center, and it doesn't reflect any other part in the brain.
Right. It's completely symmetrical, but it's in the very, very center of your brain. So if you were to like cut your head down in the very center, it literally sits in the very middle of your cerebral cortex, right? That is insane. But the 49 days part's peculiar, for one, because the pineal gland develops before the brain even develops.
Right.
And in certain Buddhist, like Tibetan cultures and religious understandings of the nature of reality, they believe that 49 days after dying, your soul reincarnates. And you can read that in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So this scientific correspondence or coincidence is definitely something to think about. And Rick Strassman kind of puts that forth in this book a little bit. So there's a lot of weird things going on. It's this weird molecule. You trip for like 5 to 10 minutes. It's an extremely powerful visionary hallucination, usually visual, characterized.
Yeah, there's no residual effects. Once the experience is over, you're not going to feel wobbly or blurred vision or anything. You're pretty much brought right back to your normal baseline state of consciousness.
Crazy. It's like up, peak, down, which is very rare. There are few substances that we know of that affect our actual perception and alter our states of consciousness to the degree in which something like DMT does at such a rapid pace to bring us up and to bring us down.
Right.
So this book is honestly all about that.
Right.
And then the rest of the book kind of talks about the actual timeline, the actual history of Rick Strassman coming into contact with this substance, his, how he ended up administering it to people. And then the rest of the book is sort of devoted to their experiences, his recounting of their experiences as he recorded them and observed them and administered the drug to them under very scientific settings in a hospital. And he sort of puts together all of their experiences to paint a vivid picture for the reader that shows all of the woo-woo, I guess, that shows all of the interconnected spirituality, that shows that most of these people are having very, very similar experiences to each other.
And they might not necessarily be equivalent to a T, but they're certainly analogous to each other.
Right. And it's very odd because when a person does something like LSD, if I were to take a tab of LSD and Connor were to do the same thing right now, in about 15 hours, when we go to describe what we had experienced, our experiences might be radically different from each other. But for the most part, the majority of folks who use DMT end up describing very similar phenomena.
Yeah. Well, it's, just a side caveat is that, and I'm pretty sure I've heard this somewhere else, but they originally wanted to call DMT telepathine because so many people would have these similar hallucinations or identical hallucinations while they were on it, and it wasn't until later that they changed it. So
right. And that's not to say people won't have different experiences.
Right.
They will, and they will differ widely, but there are these recurring motifs or recurring symbols or recurring, I guess, underlying structures of the experiences. The colors might be different, the shapes and the figures might be different, but ultimately most people are recounting very, very similar experiences when you really break it all down to the core of what's actually occurring. And one of those huge motifs is entity contact.
Yes.
So a lot of the individuals that Rick Strassman tested talk about seeing God or angels or intelligent beings, literally existing conscious beings that are on the other side of this spiritual veil that they interfaced with after using the substance that are teaching them or healing them or working with them, sometimes hurting them and damaging them in the more negative experiences. But most of the time, it's always this like weird entity contact. Not everyone experiences that, but it's very similar.
The strange part of the entity contact is that you can see them and they can also see you, and they interact with you as though you're right there in front of them. Right.
1-to-1. And that's one of the most odd sensations for anyone who's ever used the substance to to describe. And it's why people like Joe Rogan, for instance, or Dennis McKenna, which is Terrence McKenna's brother, or many other proponents of the substance. Jordan Peterson talks about ayahuasca a little bit and the peculiarities of DMT. Alex Gray, the visionary artist, who actually drew or painted, I suppose, the artwork that's on the very front of the text.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
So many of these people are describing very similar things. And Rick Strassman really highlights that in his research and study notes that he put together in this book for the audience.
Yeah, one of the things that makes that drives the book, I would say, is that it's sprinkled with really interesting anecdotes throughout, and that kind of keeps you engaged. You know, getting through all the scientific stuff. If that's not your cup of tea, you can at least get some insight into the experiences that other people have had with this.
Yep, I agree. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
and the last thing that I'll say is near the end of the book, it does get more woo-woo. It does talk about some speculation. It talks about Rick Strassman's own ideas and hypotheses and some of the other people, how they feel about things.
Right.
And sort of gets into the near-death experience, the mystical aspect of things as he tries to tie together everyone's experiences. It actually gave birth to another text that we will do a book review on as well, called DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, also written by Rick Strassman later on in life, in which he took all of the experiences that he wrote in to write this book and realized that they all are very, very similar to some of the Old Testament prophetic writings in Judaic history and culture. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said about DMT, so we'll probably do an episode or a couple of episodes of the discourse in which we talk about this, but that's the book in a nutshell for anyone who's interested in it. I do want to talk a little bit about why it was important to me.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so the book, I first came across it when I was 12 years old, honestly. I watched a film called Donnie Darko. It's a cult classic movie, and it spun me out and made me really interested in time travel and interdimensional travel and all these crazy things, and psychosis and abnormal psychology and all these things. And I asked my mom to take me to the library so I could do some research on quantum physics and time travel and all these cool things. And then going to the library, I stumbled across this book in my research, which was DMT, the Spirit Molecule, written by Rick Strassman. And I checked it out and I studied it, and it blew my mind. And I took notes up and down on sheets on an entire notebook. And by the time the summer was over and I started my first class in middle school, when we were talking about chemistry and organic chemistry, I pretty much knew every answer to every single thing because this book started me off on that path.
Right. And he's like, how did you know so much? And you're just like, I don't know. Yeah, don't worry about it.
And then
I really like chemistry.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Like I'm talking to the agents out of Matrix. Like, please don't try to brainwash me.
Yes.
Or tell my parents. Because my mom didn't really know what I was doing. She just took me to the library and thought it was cool. I was reading and studying and stuff.
Nobody knew what DMT was back then.
Hardly.
Yeah.
People like Joe Rogan had not yet popularized it.
Exactly.
But to wrap up the long story, it sent me down a path of spirituality and study and understanding. For years, I would go to websites like arrowid.com or other locations like the Nexus, and I would study about psychedelics, and it changed my world, changed my worldview, changed everything about how I look at reality itself and how I feel about spirituality and all of these things. And none of that I don't feel like could have occurred in the way that it did if it wasn't for this text.
Absolutely. Yeah, and for me, I guess I kind of grew up with this idea that there wasn't a hierarchy of good and bad drugs. I just thought that all drugs had a negative impact on your psychology and your physiology. And I guess it was interesting to learn that some drugs affect your dopaminergic system. You can think of like alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine, and that other drugs affect this totally, basically unconnected system, which is the serotonergic system. It really made me realize that, you know, just like there's good and bad food, there's good and bad drugs. Mm-hmm. And I guess it kind of gave me the courage to explore more with my consciousness.
Right.
But I think it was good that I stumbled upon it because, you know, as Terrence McKenna once did say, he said every psychedelic trip should start in the library.
Yes.
And I recommend if anyone is even thinking about, I mean, obviously I don't recommend anyone do drugs at all, but if you're going to, read books about it first and listen to what other people have to say about it, because safety is huge.
I highly agree.
Yeah.
So in doing the preliminary research that I did, I came across very many like-minded philosophers and psychonauts who share the same sentiment, and I agree 100%. Mm-hmm. If you do pick this book up and you do read it and you do, for some reason, decide like you want to go out and experience these things or try them for yourselves, quick disclaimer for YouTube or any other platform that you might be listening on. We're not advocating for drugs and drug use. We're just
Educational
educating
purposes.
and
Yep.
talking about these things objectively. And research and knowledge is your biggest tool. The old cliche that knowledge is power is the truth. Knowing what you're doing before you get into it is so important, especially with something like taking a psychedelic drug, because you're essentially playing with nuclear warheads, and these things are beyond your control. When you use these drugs, you have to use them with a level of integrity and surrender. You have to be prepared to be shown the greatest of heavens and the greatest of hells. You have to be willing to go up and down,
Yes.
sort of be yanked left and right.
Absolutely.
As you have no control. You're just along for the ride, and you're learning things about yourself, and they can be very, very positive spiritual tools for learning and growth. And they're very beautiful, but they are also very dangerous.
Yes.
And having knowledge before you take them, such as dosage, what to do if you mess the dosage up, having the correct set and setting, ensuring that you're surrounded by the right people, that you have a sitter handy, that you've prepared the correct diet before you eat, and all of these other things that you need to take into consideration. The history of the drug, the legality of the drug, how to properly prepare the drug, things like that, so important. And this book, I found it important for the same reason that you did, that it started me off on the path of understanding these things before I just willy-nilly went out and tried anything in the world, which potentially could have harmed me or others.
Absolutely.
So this book
And you had
was-
more reverence for it as well.
Exactly, and you treat it with respect, and you treat it as it needs to be treated, sacred.
Right.
Entheogens are called entheogens,
Which means to generate God from within, by the way.
rather than calling it a drug. We
Right.
call it an entheogen. So all that being said, the final thing that I think is a positive of this book, why you should read it, is if you're a scientifically oriented person, very reductionist in the way that you look at the world, positivist, materialist, perhaps you just don't tolerate woo-woo at all. This book is very objective. Rick Strassman does dabble a little bit in the woo-woo and some speculation again, but for the most part, it's pretty objective, and it should be right up your alley. So with that, thank you for sticking around to the end of this episode. Please leave a like, comment, and share, and a subscribe if you really enjoyed this content. Let us know what we can do to improve. That being said, moving forward, we will be doing many more book reviews in the near future. The next one that you can look out for is Rick Strassman's follow-up book, DMT and the Solar Prophecy, and that's going to spark an entire gambit of conversations I'm extremely excited to have with you, Connor.
Absolutely.
And finally, we want to thank you again for joining us and continuing the great conversation.